Rachel Sullivan walked into the crowded mess hall at Naval Station Norfolk, her combat boots making soft sounds against the polished floor. The noise of hundreds of sailors eating breakfast filled the air. She wore the same navy blue uniform as everyone else, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was different from any other sailor in the room. At 28, Rachel stood 5'6" and tall with an athletic build that she kept hidden under her loose-fitting uniform. Her brown eyes scanned the room, automatically noting exit points and potential threats. This habit had been drilled into her during years of specialized training that most people in this room would never experience. She grabbed a tray and joined the serving line, moving with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this countless times before. The kitchen staff member behind the counter smiled warmly as she scooped scrambled eggs onto Rachel's plate. "Good morning, Petty Officer. How are you today?" the woman asked cheerfully. Rachel returned the smile politely. "Doing well, thanks," she replied, keeping her response brief and pleasant. The server added bacon and 2 slices of wheat toast before Rachel moved down the line to collect orange juice and coffee. Small talk had never been Rachel's strength, not because she was unfriendly, but because years of classified work had taught her that the less people remembered about her, the better. She had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, engaging just enough to avoid seeming standoffish while revealing nothing memorable about herself. Finding an empty table in the back corner of the mess hall, Rachel set down her tray and settled into the hard plastic chair. She preferred corner positions for breakfast, places where she could sit with her back to the wall and observe the entire room. This wasn't paranoia, it was professional habit developed through extensive training in threat assessment and situational awareness. As she began eating, Rachel's mind was already organizing her schedule for the day. She had intelligence reports to review, equipment maintenance to supervise, and a classified briefing scheduled for 1,400 hours. None of these activities matched her official cover as a logistics specialist, but that was precisely the point of maintaining a cover identity. Across the mess hall, 4 male recruits were finishing their own breakfast at a table roughly 20 feet away. They had arrived at Naval Station Norfolk 3 weeks earlier, fresh from completing basic training at Great Lakes. The confidence that came from surviving boot camp still radiated from them like heat from pavement on a summer day. They were young, probably 19 or 20 years old, and filled with the certainty that comes before real military experience teaches humility. Jake Morrison, the tallest of the group with sandy brown hair and a Texas drawl, was the first to notice Rachel. Sitting alone, he nudged his friend Marcus Chen with his elbow. "Check out the girl sitting by herself," Jake said, his voice carrying just slightly too far to be considered private conversation. Marcus, a shorter recruit from California who had struggled with the physical demands of basic training, followed Jake's gaze and smirked. "What's she doing eating alone? Probably can't handle being around real sailors," he said, his tone dripping with unearned superiority. Tommy Rodriguez, the third member of their group, leaned forward with interest. Tommy was smaller than his friends, but compensated with an outsized personality and a tendency toward aggressive posturing. "You know what I heard?" Tommy said, cracking his knuckles in a gesture he probably thought looked intimidating. "They're lowering standards to let more women into combat roles. It's making the whole Navy weaker." The 4th recruit, David Kim from Ohio, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Unlike his friends, David felt increasingly uneasy about the direction their conversation was taking. His parents had raised him to treat everyone with respect, regardless of gender, but the peer pressure from his new military friends was making him question whether those values would make him seem weak. Rachel continued eating her breakfast with apparent focus, but her trained hearing picked up every word of their conversation. She had encountered this type of attitude many times throughout her military career. Some men struggled to accept women in traditionally male roles, especially in elite units where physical capability was constantly tested. Rachel had learned long ago that responding to every ignorant comment would exhaust her energy and accomplish nothing. She had learned to pick her battles carefully, to distinguish between mere ignorance that could be ignored and genuine threats that required response. The 4 recruits finished their breakfast and stood up from their table. Rachel assumed they would leave the mess hall and she could finish her meal in peace. Instead, she noticed through her peripheral vision that they were walking directly toward her table. The dynamic in the room began to shift subtly. Other sailors at nearby tables sensed the change in atmosphere and began paying attention while trying to appear as though they weren't watching. Rachel set down her fork and took a slow breath, her body language remaining relaxed even as her mind shifted into a heightened state of awareness. Jake reached Rachel's table first and positioned himself directly across from her, his hands resting on his hips in a posture meant to convey dominance. "Excuse me, sailor," he began, his tone carrying a false politeness that barely masked his condescension. "My buddies and I were having a discussion, and we're curious about something. What exactly qualifies you to wear that uniform? Don't you think there are better places for someone like you?" Rachel looked up from her breakfast slowly, her brown eyes meeting Jake's gaze with calm neutrality. She had dealt with bullies in various forms throughout her life, from elementary school playgrounds to advanced military training courses. She knew that emotional reactions only encouraged them and escalated situations unnecessarily. "I'm qualified because I completed the same training requirements as everyone else in this room," Rachel replied evenly, her voice carrying clearly without rising in volume. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my breakfast." Marcus moved to stand beside Jake, crossing his arms over his chest in a pose clearly meant to intimidate. "That's not really an answer, though, is it? Everyone knows they've made things easier for women. You didn't really earn that uniform the same way we did." The conversation was beginning to draw more obvious attention now. Sailors at the three nearest tables had stopped their own discussions entirely and were openly watching the confrontation develop. Some looked concerned about where this might lead, while others seemed merely curious about how the situation would resolve itself. The mess hall's usual background noise of conversation and clattering dishes had noticeably diminished. Tommy circled around to Rachel's left side, effectively beginning to surround her position at the table. "Maybe you got confused during the recruitment process," he said with a nasty grin that he probably practiced in mirrors. "The Navy isn't some social club where everyone gets participation trophies. This is serious business that requires real strength." David reluctantly took his position to complete the circle around Rachel Sullivan, though his body language remained uncertain. He still felt deeply uncomfortable with what was happening, but the fear of being rejected by his peer group was stronger than his moral objections. The four recruits now had Rachel completely surrounded, though she continued eating as if their presence was merely a minor annoyance rather than a potential threat. "I think you owe the men in this room an apology," Jake continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed an audience gathering. "You're taking up a spot that could have gone to someone who actually belongs here. Maybe you should consider transferring to a position more suitable for your abilities. I hear the administrative offices always need help with filing." Rachel carefully set down her fork and looked up at the four young men surrounding her. Her expression remained perfectly calm, but something subtle shifted in her eyes. A casual observer might not notice the change, but anyone with real combat experience would recognize the transition from relaxed awareness to focused readiness. Her body remained still, but every muscle was now prepared for immediate action. "I'm not interested in continuing this conversation," Rachel said quietly, her tone carrying an edge of finality that the recruits were too inexperienced to recognize as a warning. "I'm going to give you all one opportunity to walk away from this table and return to your own business. What happens next depends entirely on your decision in the next 5 seconds." The mess hall was growing noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the tense confrontation developing in the corner. Some sailors were reaching for their phones, though whether to call security or to record what they sensed would be an interesting encounter was unclear. Several senior enlisted personnel had noticed the disturbance and were beginning to make their way over to intervene, but they were still too far away to reach the scene quickly. Jake leaned forward, placing both hands flat on Rachel's table in a gesture of aggressive dominance. "We're not going anywhere until you learn some respect for the men who actually earned the right to be here. You need to understand your place." Rachel's extensive training kicked into full operation as she assessed the tactical situation with the speed of long practice. 4 opponents, all larger than her by at least 30 pounds and several inches in height. They were young and probably strong from their recent basic training. They had positioned themselves to block her movement in all directions, clearly intending to intimidate her through superior numbers and size. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they had just made the single biggest mistake of their short military careers. The other sailors in the mess hall held their collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Some began actively reaching for their phones to call security, while others prepared to either help break up a fight or get out of the way of whatever was coming. Rachel slowly pushed her breakfast tray away and stood up from the table, her movements controlled and deliberate, like a coiled spring preparing to release its stored energy. Rachel rose slowly to her full height, her movements fluid and economical, despite being surrounded by 4 hostile recruits. She was noticeably shorter than all 4 men, but her posture radiated a confidence that seemed completely out of proportion to her tactical disadvantage. The mess hall had grown eerily quiet, with hundreds of sailors now aware that something extraordinary was about to unfold in their midst. "Last chance," Rachel said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere. "Walk away right now and we can all forget this ever happened. Stay, and you're going to learn a lesson you'll remember for the rest of your lives." Jake Morrison laughed loudly, thinking he had successfully cornered and intimidated the lone female sailor. "You're not in any position to be making threats, lady. There are 4 of us and 1 of you. Basic math says you should be the one backing down." Marcus Chen stepped even closer, emboldened by Jake's words and the presence of his friends. She's probably never been in a real confrontation in her entire life. These military women are all talk until someone actually challenges them. What the 4 recruits didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know from looking at her, was that Rachel Sullivan had graduated from the Navy's basic underwater demolition SEAL training 18 months earlier. She was one of fewer than 10 women who had ever completed the notoriously brutal program that broke most candidates regardless of gender. Her official military record listed her specialty as logistics, but this was an elaborate cover story designed to protect her real identity and enable classified operations. During her SEAL training, Rachel had endured months of the most physically and mentally demanding military instruction in the world. She had learned to operate effectively in hostile environments, had mastered multiple forms of hand-to-hand combat, and had been taught to make split-second tactical decisions under extreme pressure. The 4 young recruits surrounding her had no concept that they were confronting one of the military's most elite warriors. Tommy Rodriguez moved even closer, attempting to intimidate Rachel with his physical presence. "I think she's actually scared," he taunted, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "Look at her just standing there. She knows she can't handle up on all 4 of us." Rachel's extensive training had taught her to read body language and assess threats with remarkable speed and accuracy. She could see that Jake was the group's clear leader and probably the most aggressive fighter. Marcus seemed nervous despite his tough words, trying to prove himself to his friends rather than acting from genuine confidence. Tommy was the loudest, but likely had the least discipline and training. David appeared deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, but was going along due to peer pressure rather than personal conviction. In her mind, Rachel was already planning her response sequence if the situation escalated to physical violence. She had been taught to end confrontations quickly and efficiently, using minimal force when possible, but overwhelming force when absolutely necessary. The confined space of the mess hall would actually work to her advantage, limiting the recruits' ability to use their size and numbers effectively against someone with superior training and technique. Marcus reached out to grab Rachel's arm, intending to physically intimidate her into submission. This was the precise moment Rachel had been waiting for, the instant when their harassment crossed from verbal to physical and gave her legal justification to respond with force. The moment his hand made contact with her uniform sleeve, she moved with lightning speed that caught all 4 recruits completely off guard. Rachel grabbed Marcus's extended wrist with her left hand, while simultaneously stepping forward and driving her right elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The strike landed exactly where she intended, hitting the nerve cluster with enough force to temporarily paralyze his diaphragm without causing permanent damage. Marcus doubled over instantly, gasping desperately for breath and completely eliminated from the fight. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Before the other 3 recruits could process what had just happened to their friend, Rachel continued her momentum without pause. She spun Marcus around and used him briefly as a human shield while she assessed her remaining opponents, then released him to stumble backward, still trying to catch his breath. Tommy's street-fighting instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward from her left side, trying to grab Rachel from behind in a bear hug. But Rachel had been tracking his movement through her peripheral vision from the moment the physical confrontation began. She ducked smoothly under his grasping arms and executed a precise leg sweep, her boot connecting with Tommy's ankles at exactly the right angle and with perfect timing. Tommy's forward momentum combined with his suddenly absent footing sent him crashing hard into an empty table. Trays and dishes scattered across the floor in a cacophony of clattering metal and breaking ceramic. The mess hall erupted in surprised shouts and gasps from the watching sailors. Cell phone cameras were now openly recording the encounter as word spread instantly that something extraordinary was happening. David took an instinctive step backward, finally understanding with terrible clarity that they had made a catastrophic mistake. The woman they had thought was an easy target was systematically dismantling his group with techniques he had never seen outside of professional martial arts demonstrations. Jake, watching his friends being defeated in rapid succession, decided to rush Rachel himself. He charged forward with his fists raised, planning to overpower her with his superior size and strength through sheer aggression. But Rachel had been expecting exactly this response from the group's alpha male. As Jake approached, Rachel sidestepped his clumsy attack with minimal movement and grabbed his extended arm with both hands. Using his own considerable momentum against him, she executed a textbook hip throw that sent Jake flying over her shoulder. He landed hard on his back on the mess hall floor with an impact that knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. The entire confrontation from first contact to final throw had lasted less than 15 seconds. 3 of the 4 recruits were on the ground or disabled, and the 4th was backing away rapidly with his hands raised in clear surrender. The mess hall fell completely silent as hundreds of sailors stared in absolute amazement at what they had just witnessed. The mess hall remained eerily silent for several long seconds after the brief but decisive encounter. 3 of the 4 recruits lay on the floor in various states of defeat, while David Kim stood frozen with his hands raised, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Rachel Sullivan stood calmly in the center of the chaos, barely breathing hard despite having just disabled 3 attackers in under 15 seconds. Her expression remained neutral, showing neither satisfaction nor anger, just professional calm. Jake Morrison groaned as he struggled to sit up, one hand pressed against his lower back where he had impacted the floor. He looked up at Rachel with an expression of complete disbelief, his earlier confidence shattered entirely. Marcus Chen was still doubled over, but slowly regaining his ability to breathe normally. Though the precisely placed strike to his solar plexus had taught him more about real combat than months of basic training. Tommy Rodriguez lay tangled among overturned chairs, favoring his swept ankle but not seriously injured. The physical pain was nothing compared to the shame of being so easily defeated. Chief Petty Officer Williams pushed through the crowd that had formed around the incident. He had been in the Navy for 22 years and had seen enough real combat to recognize elite-level skills when he witnessed them. His experienced eyes quickly took in the scene, noting how efficiently Rachel had neutralized each threat while using only the minimum necessary force. "Everyone step back and give them some room," Chief Williams commanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The gathered sailors immediately complied, creating a wider circle around the aftermath of the brief encounter. David Kim slowly lowered his hands, realizing that Rachel had no intention of attacking him since he had clearly surrendered. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his voice shaking with genuine remorse. "We didn't know. We thought we were just going to scare you a little. We had no idea you were actually trained like that." Rachel looked at David with an expression that was stern but contained a hint of understanding. "You thought what exactly?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet mess hall. "That because I'm a woman I couldn't defend myself? That I didn't earn this uniform? That I don't belong here?" Jake finally managed to get to his feet, though he moved carefully and kept one hand pressed against his aching back. The arrogance that had driven him to confront Rachel had evaporated completely, replaced by the sobering realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. "We made a serious mistake," Jake admitted, his voice much quieter than it had been during the confrontation. "We didn't realize you were trained at that level, Those weren't normal fighting techniques. Chief Williams stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Is anyone seriously injured?" he asked professionally. When the four recruits shook their heads, indicating they were bruised but not badly hurt, he nodded with visible relief. What exactly happened here? Several sailors began speaking at once, eager to share what they had witnessed. The consensus was absolutely clear. The four recruits had surrounded and harassed Rachel. She had tried multiple times to de-escalate peacefully, and she had only acted in self-defense when physically grabbed. Chief Williams turned his attention to Rachel, studying her with the careful eye of someone who had seen many different types of warriors throughout his long career. Something about her efficiency and composure was triggering recognition in his experienced mind. "Petty Officer Sullivan," he said formally, "I think we need to have a private conversation about your background and training. Those weren't standard Navy combat techniques you just demonstrated. That was something significantly more advanced." Rachel met the chief's gaze steadily, knowing that her carefully maintained cover story was about to be challenged by someone with enough experience to recognize the truth. The careful balance she had maintained between her public identity as a logistics specialist and her classified role as a SEAL operator was beginning to collapse. "Yes, Chief," she replied simply, offering no additional information without being specifically asked. Her training had taught her to reveal classified information only when absolutely necessary and through proper channels. The crowd of sailors continued buzzing with excitement and speculation about what they had witnessed. Videos of the encounter were already spreading rapidly across social media platforms, though none of the participants knew it yet. The brief fight was becoming viral, even as they stood in its immediate aftermath. Jake looked at his three friends, all of whom appeared as shaken and confused as he felt. They had entered the mess hall that morning as confident young recruits who thought they understood how the world worked. They were leaving as humbled sailors who had just learned a harsh but valuable lesson about assumptions, respect, and the danger of judging people based on appearance rather than capability.